Hello, and welcome to this 2 p.m. session. I'm Shireen Chengadu, faculty member at GIBS, and welcome on day 13 of lockdown. So I'm assuming if you've joined at this hour that you, like me, are hungry for connection, even if it's just remotely. So we are going to get started because these flash videos do go in a flash. And I am going to ask that I do the presentation first. Usually it's quite interactive, but in 30 minutes, I've just got to manage time. And so I would ask if you kept your Q&A, we kept Q&A to the end so that I could respond to you perfectly at that time. But please make note of your questions or comments, and I'll be sure to get back to you. So I am now going to go into the actual and you would if you are anything like me, your head feels like the left-hand side of the screen. We've had too much crowd our heads. Even before COVID-19, life has been full and complex and voices coming to us from all quarters. And then you add COVID-19 to the mix, there's even greater uncertainty and complexity. What I do want to take you to is to the right of the screen, in which we look at attention as the currency of our lives. And I borrowed this from Caroline Webb, who's a behavioral economist. And she talks about how in paying attention very mindfully to the things we do, we can actually improve how we manage ourselves, how we manage others, and how we manage uncertainty and complexity. Now, I am certain in the last 12 days and 8 hours, you've had some sense of what it means to rest. Some of you would argue not so much, because when you're working from home, you probably work longer hours and you lose track of time. But you've worked in a way that is probably less stressful. You probably have been following all the tips around making sure you have some downtime, a little bit of exercise, eating correctly. And if my husband's watching, he'd probably agree that I've not been the perfect example of it, but I am trying. So my getaways have been remote, and like that fantastic SA tourism advert, I'll do my traveling when this is over, and I'm looking forward to it. And I'm sure lots of us with cabin fever are all doing pretty much the same. I want to take us back to not long ago when we were jubilant and we celebrated the hashtag Stronger Together. It was the Rugby World Cup. Need I say more? Sia Khaleesi and the boys brought home the cup to South Africa. It came at the perfect time. We needed that lift. That moment of lift, literally and figuratively, made us stronger together. We all celebrated. And at the start of 2020, this COVID-19, this unknown entity and force entered our lives, and it affected business, government, society, international, regional, national. We are all in this together. And what we quickly cotton onto is that there's no time for egos. Again, it is about being stronger together. If we're going to win this war against this enemy or this unseen enemy, it has to be by working together. But as I started to talk about and think about this presentation today, I know you are all COVID-19 out. And let me say, I am no expert on the various facets of this, whether it's medical, the economics, the socio-dynamics. But what I do want to bring to you is a different perspective on what COVID-19 has done for me and what I want to share with you in terms of leadership and how men and women collaborate and co-create as equals in order for greater good. And I think when I think about COVID-19, it has to be a humbling experience. It is a great leveler. And this is where I want to take us to now. It is no longer business or life or leadership as usual. Everything you and I knew the rug has been pulled from right under our feet. I would like to invite you for a minute to be silent. And I'm going to ring my coffee bell to signal the end of our 1 minute. But just for now, to quieten the voices, the many, many voices that come at us from all quarters, just to enjoy a minute of silence. And your time starts now. Thank you. Now that I have your undivided attention, through a mindfulness practice, I brought you to what we need to focus on for this next 25 minutes or so. Coming back to it is no longer business, life, or leadership as usual. Picture this. A CEO is being interviewed on a radio talk show. In the midst of what coronavirus represents for the corporate entity, for job security, and suddenly he starts to sob. The interviewer breaks down. What is interesting is that this happened on the Bruce Whitfield live talk show on 702, when Grant Patterson, the EdCon chief executive, begins to cry because of what this time represents for him as a leader, but more importantly, for the 30,000 strong staff, and for every one person employed at EdCon, the 6 or 7 people who are reliant on that one individual. But what is so important about this is the fact that both Bruce and Grant cried during this interview. Now, you would usually think that this is an attribute of breaking down, showing emotion. It is an attribute of women, because women, when they're emotional, and you've heard this narrative and rhetoric, may become tearful. And what I applaud in this interview is that Grant, who's a seasoned CEO, chose to be a relevant leader for the times in which we live and work. And Bruce allowed his authentic self to emerge in this live interview. That is a poignant moment. And it takes me to this very interesting quote that Christine Lagarde in 2014 wrote in one of her keynote addresses when she talked about the economic power of women's empowerment. And she referenced this famous quote by Japanese writer and feminist Reiko Hiratsuko, who said, "In the beginning, woman was truly the sun, an authentic person." And today, meaning in the midst of our lockdown and COVID-19 and economic uncertainty. More than ever, the global economy needs precisely this kind of radiant sun to provide light and nourishment, to provide healing, to dry out the swamps of poverty and unrest. And when I hark back to when I just spoke about Bruce and Grant, that was so powerful because they allowed their authentic selves, their head, heart, and hands part of leadership to emerge, not to be confused with hierarchical leadership and a strong leader and a male does not cry, especially in a public domain. So what I want to share with you at this point is a very interesting perspective on gender equality during this time. You may or may not have thought about this, but why the coronavirus fallout may be worse for women than it is for men. Did you know that women comprise the majority of health and social care workers and are on the front lines of the fight against COVID-19? So they would be the essential services having to deal primarily at the coalface of this virus. And might I add, if you look at the sectors, it would be women who are nurses or doctors, women in social care who are playing this increased and massive role during this time. Then, in the midst of it, we had mass school closures. Yes, I know for those of you who are parents with little ones, you probably feeling this pinch far more than I am feeling. But women have been particularly affected because they still bear much of the responsibility for childcare. And I'm not thumbsucking this. The research that Karen Skeppers and I did for our Women Leadership in Emerging Markets book in 2017 reiterated this, and the data emerged that this was factual. And suddenly in this new lockdown environment, women have far more responsibilities in terms of the child caring, because your child sees you at home and assumes that you're there, even though you're working remotely, that you can suddenly be there, playing TV games, doing some online learning. I was speaking to my niece in Cape Town today, and she was telling me her two little ones, 6 and 10, have a full school day. In fact, I called her in the middle of her recess and she said, well, I only have a few minutes because I have to do the PE session. So we are suddenly seeing a lot of added responsibility during this time. And then we know, again from data and evidence-based, that women already do 3 times as much of the unpaid care work than men. And caring for relatives in this time, not that you would be able to see them, but maybe through distance, adds and burden, becomes an additional burden during this period. And out of this, over the last few days, we've seen in the reports in South Africa, the gender-based violence cases. At the last count, it was something like 2,200, and that was in the first week of lockdown. So there's an interesting perspective emerging from COVID-19 around what it means to build inclusive environments, whether it is work, whether it's in the home front, whether it is in society, and we're starting to see a lot more interesting nuances emerge. So through this coronavirus crisis, we are increasing our appreciation for authenticity. The fact that I can sit at home in the comfort of my home and still talk to you with authority on what I'm delivering, with authenticity, give you a snapshot of what my life looks like in my home, And you know, my puppies may have just come into the room. Last week I was doing a session. My husband just popped his head through the door and said, I'm taking Scooby to the vet. Communication becomes key. Trust is heightened. Relationships become front and center. And we're doing these virtual hugs. We're having Zoom celebrations with our friends and loved ones. Leaders are communicating daily with their teams who are working remotely and feeling a little bit anxious, or if not a little bit, a lot of anxiety. We also, in this time, have an increased appreciation for verifiable facts and being prepared for any scenario. And I stress the verifiable because we know there are certain leaders around the world who are, they're not subscribing to this very well. But it turns out that these are the very same criteria that investing experts are using to rate categories of the category of stocks that have been outperforming the S&P 500 during this crisis. And they're stocks with high ESG, in other words, environment, social, and governance ratings. And this correlation is what gives us important insights into what makes a great leader for the VUCA times and the times in which we find ourselves. The surprising lesson in this crisis about leadership is that the very leadership qualities we need right now, those that we value and crave, are those, as studies showed, associated with the way women lead, and why those companies with more women leaders perform better across all metrics, including financially. So this brings me to this point about the imperatives for women leadership in the midst of COVID-19. That one, it is an economic imperative. Two, it is a justice-based approach imperative or a moral imperative. And a third, crucially important imperative is that we need leadership diversity for the times in which we live and work. And we know that whole idea of the way in which we live and work, the whole thing has been tilted on the axis. I'm reminded here of an interesting book that I read called The Athena Doctrine, written by two men, interestingly, John Gazima and Michael D'Antonio in 2013, and they talked about, the book is how women and men who think like them will rule the future. In other words, how feminine values, not just in women, but in men and women, can solve our toughest problems and build a more prosperous future. I'm wondering, will this change the perception of leadership? Will our perception of leadership, what looks like leadership, what we've come to know leadership to look like, will our perception of that change? Nancy Pelosi, into her 70s and standing strong against one of the most powerful leaders in the world. So historically, qualities associated with women have been undervalued, causing women leaders to be undervalued. And this is shown in a study in the Harvard Business Review by behavioral economist Paolo Cecchi-Demiglio, as an example. I'm now moving on to some of the greatest lessons that I've learned, that I've been in talking to executives, in talking to chief executives, to talking to women and men across the board, whether they're in business, government, or society. These have stood out for me as some of the greatest leadership lessons on diversity and inclusion during or from COVID-19. Number one, vulnerability. boy, oh boy, how vulnerable did this make us feel? We had to go into lockdown in a short period of time. And guess what? In this period of letting ourselves be vulnerable, and probably because we were all in this together, we started to become creative and innovative. And we braved the wilderness, all shapes and form of wilderness. And this comes from the beautiful work of Brené Brown, Daring Greatly. We dared greatly in this first 12, 13 days, and will do so for the next period of the lockdown. But also in vulnerability, we allowed our authentic selves to emerge. Authenticity is key to leadership. And leadership says we don't have to have one view or one perspective of leadership. Leadership can take on different personas, and we've seen this across the world. We've seen this right now here in our own territory. And then, of course, we've been catapulted in the fourth industrial revolution. We were talking about this. We were ready, not so ready, and then suddenly, boom, technology was in our faces. Suddenly, we all were Zooming, Microsoft Teaming, Skyping, Cisco WebEx, and. And guess what? The future of work is here. We've been talking about the future of work. Well, hello, it is here. You and I are engaging in the future of work right now. And the more we work from home, we trying and testing this. And so silos are out. And we see that there's complexity. There's no one answer to any of this in all the complexity and the intractable problems we're dealing with. There's an intersectionality and complexity and simultaneity coming from the work of Holvino in 2010 on the basis of race, gender, class, ethnicity, generations, internationalization, religion, sexual identity, differently abled. We are no longer working in silos. And this beautiful thing that has evaded us for so long, work-life balance, I still don't know if we can achieve it, especially when we get stuck to our home remote working, but certainly how we've given ourselves permission during this vulnerable time to integrate and merge work and life. Today, I've made the big effort to dress up and put on a bit of makeup for you, but other than that, it was just me and the people who are dearest to me around. And so we've gone into effective and open communication, great leadership that shows open communication and listens to expertise and the other voices, the voices we didn't value before. And we move very quickly from, well, most people did, most leaders did, from ecosystems to ecosystems. We saw how we needed to work business, government, society. We saw how we needed to work nationally, regionally, and internationally in order to solve the big problems. And this time brought us a new way of being that is human-centered, first and foremost. It is inclusive and sustainable if we continue this way. And this is not me. This was the theme for the WEF in 2019, where the theme was globalization 4.0. And the three elements of it was human-centeredness, inclusion, and sustainability. And so as we come to this point, time does go very quickly. 30 minutes does fly by. I want us to bring us to this beautiful time of reflection and healing, and then to reflect on how we will behave afterwards. In other words, what would we have learned from this and what will change? Otherwise, we would have let a good crisis go to waste. And I would like to end with this. And I'm going to read it, but you can follow for yourself. And the people stayed at home and read books and listened and rested and exercised. some more than others, and made art and played games and learned new ways of being and were still. And listened more deeply. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced. How beautiful is that, to dance with abandonment? Some met their shadows after a very long time, and the people began to think differently. And the people healed. And in the absence of people living in ignorant, dangerous, mindless, and heartless ways, the earth began to heal. And when the danger passed and the people joined together again, they grieved their losses and made new choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. And this comes from the beautiful words of Kitty O'Meara. And before I invite you to this, I would like to share 3 very quick personal stories with you during this time. The first is, in this time of personal reflection, my family and I went through a terrible loss of our beloved, one of our 2 beloved puppies who'd been with us for a long 14 years. So not quite puppies. But this time gave my husband and I and my family in our various homes to reflect quietly and give thanks and gratitude. And in this time, I also learned how beautiful my husband's values were. I'd forgotten some of them, and I don't always say it. But I learned just before coming onto this live session, he had my coffee ready and a Jolly Jammer. Yes, I know that's not quite the right diet for this time, but I'm allowed 1 Jolly Jammer. And the second story is that of Kalyani Pillay, who was the ex-CEO of Sabric, who in April last year was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And she wrote a beautiful thing. And she said, nothing made her as afraid as COVID-19. She said, at that time when she had to give up her job as CEO and she was at home. So she was in lockdown, she says, from that time. And this gave her a new appreciation for her husband who worked from home, but also a new appreciation for life. And the last personal story, I had the good fortune of listening to a wonderful individual called Mervyn Cerebro, who's a non-executive director of Vukile Property. And in a talk that he gave last week, he said, the world will never be the same. It will be better. One in which we will care for human beings and the need for each other. Thank you very much for your 30 minutes. Time went by so quick. I know I enjoyed this engagement with you. I hope you enjoyed the engagement equally. But just to remind you that if you've been touched by some of what I've shared, please join us at GIBS, one of the women leadership programs in which both women and men can participate in various forms. Join us in a year-long program. There's a Leading Women program starting in May, and then we run both open and in-house Women as Leaders programs throughout the year. Visit the website, and I look forward to engaging with you face-to-face, hopefully not long from now. But until then, for the rest of the lockdown, stay safe, stay healthy, God bless.